Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camille Defar. I am the head of the Jacques Delors Energy Center, and I'm very glad to welcome you this afternoon to our event on Franco-German perspectives on energy economists. So this event is co-hosted by the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, together with our sister think tank, the Jacques Delors Centre in Berlin. It is an initiative from the French Treasury, and I would like to thank all the teams that made this event possible. So, with energy having risen to the top of the political agenda, there are numerous challenges, from energy security to the green transition. And following yesterday's celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Élysée Treaty, we see a need for an even greater German and French cooperation at all levels, including the academic and the policy field. This is why we're really excited to have this dialogue between young researchers, young research voices, together with policy experts from both sides of the Rhine. So this event will be structured in two parts. The first part, we will have an academic input by young economists. We will have 10 minutes presentations, followed by a 5-minute Q&A for each presentee. So don't hesitate to use the Q&A chat to ask your question. And then as a second part of the event, we will have a policy dialogue with policy experts that will react to the young economists' perspectives. And this part will be moderated by the co-director of the Jacques Delors Centre in Berlin, Johannes Linder. So without further ado, I will let the floor to Stefan Lamp, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Madrid.
All right, I think you should see my screen now. Yes, it's okay. All right, thank you. Well, thank you very much for including me into the program. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of energy tax exemptions on industrial production. This is joint work with Andreas Gerste, who's a postdoc also at the University of Mannheim. So most environmental regulations are implemented in a way that they only apply to certain nations or jurisdictions. A common example would be a carbon tax. You can think of the carbon tax being implemented in France, only applies to firms located in France, but also at the supranational level. We have the EU ETS, that applies only to firms located in Europe, but not abroad. This type of policy design naturally leads to some concerns about leakage of both industrial activity and also emissions, meaning that firms might find it profitable to relocate in order to avoid the regulation. And this might lead to job losses, but also have a negative impact on emissions. And if it's a global pollutant, there's CO2. So we don't care where it's emitted, but it should be regulated overall. A common policy response that we see are relatively stringent regulations with exemption schemes, and those are often oriented towards energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries. These exemption schemes, more broadly from environmental regulations, are no exemptions. So the OECD lists over 2,000 type of exemption schemes, and many apply to the industrial sector. However, this type of policy design raises the question how far industries should be protected. Of course, this lingers towards what is the main impact on competitiveness of those regulations on firms, but also exempting those firms from paying levies or taxes, of course, might have an adverse effect on the energy use. So in terms of energy efficiency investment, that might be negative. So there's a clear trade-off here. And the second question is also, how does the design of the exemption might influence production decision of those firms? So in this paper, we're going to study this question in the context of the renewable energy levy in Germany. The renewable energy levy is a tax on electricity prices that has been introduced to finance the large subsidy scheme for renewable energies in Germany already back in 2000s. And the main important thing about this policy is to bear in mind is that this levy or tax practically divides the total amount that is paid for subsidy by all electricity users, and so all users alike, like the households as well as the industrial sector or the commercial sectors, need to pay this levy as a per unit surcharge on electricity prices. And now the increase in renewable energy deployment in these last years has led also to a huge surge in the total subsidy cost. which was initially here in 2010 around 8 billion euros. So that's tripled to 24 billion in a few years only. And this becomes very clear when we look at the evolution of prices in the industrial sector. So what I'm plotting here is the average electricity prices paid by medium-sized industry. As you can see, overall, there's been an increase in prices over those years. But also when we split the total amount, here the height of the bar, into the electricity price without the renewable energy levy. So this is all electricity purchase, other type of taxes, and the small red part representing the renewable energy levy. So that part that is really used to finance renewables. We see that over time, this has increased considerably in importance. And in last years, from 2013 onwards, this represents approximately 30% of electricity prices. So for firms being exempted or not from paying this levy, this can have impact potentially. Now, in this paper, what we're doing is we combine very detailed data from the German manufacturing census over 11 years, 2007 to 2017, with plants that are exempted from this renewable energy levy. Nice thing about this data set is that we can really look at plant level data. So we have information at the plant level about energy inputs, but as well as other type of outputs, output, employment, exports, for example. And we also have more detailed information on what type of cost structure these firms have. So we can recover information about gross value added, but also electricity and energy costs. The main focus of the paper is empirically. So we'd like to assess what's the impact of these exemption schemes on plant level inputs and outputs under two distinct policy designs. I want to talk about those in a second. But in addition to those reduced form estimates, so we also have in the paper a small model of production that allows us to talk towards some stylized facts that we see in the data and also perform counterfactual analysis. I'll come back to this towards the end of my talk. Let me just briefly start by giving you a bit more details about the exemption policy itself. So we're going to focus on the original policy exemption from the renewable energy levy, which was in place from 2003 onwards until 2012, the reform that took place in 2013. Under the original policy, firms were eligible for the exemption if they had a sufficiently high electricity consumption and they were electricity intensive, meaning that their total electricity cost to gross value added at the firm level needed to surpass a certain threshold. In this original design, as I said, like firms need to consume a sufficiently large amount of electricity. It was set at 10 gigawatt hours in order to be eligible for the exemption. And also important, I think the policy to consider, there was a time gap between the period that determines eligibility and the time when firms were actually then exempted. What is interesting is that the original policy design had been implemented as a notched policy scheme. You can see an example here on the left-hand side. A notched policy design means that a firm that is eligible for the exemption, so that just surpasses the 10 gigawatt hour of electricity use, will be exempted for almost all its electricity use, so all inframarginal units that are also below. So there are large incentives for firms to potentially manipulate or increase the electricity use to some extent in order to be eligible for the exemption. This has been reformed later on, so there's been some further changes, but most importantly, the notch has been reduced, and a reformed schedule that was valid from 2013 onwards. There was no more this tax notch available. So in the paper, we're going to compare those two schemes in order to be able to say something about what's the impact of policy design on exemptions. Here you can see some of the outcome variables that we're studying in the paper. So this is for the reformed schedule, local electricity or gas or other type of energy inputs, and also some firm level out. As you can see relatively clear from this chart, like firms that have been exempted in this policy have higher use of electricity compared to the matched control group in this case, while we don't find any effect on type of competitiveness indicators that we show in the lower part here. Just regarding main findings, so we find under both exemption schemes that exemptions lead to increase in electricity use. There's some evidence that firms might be able to do fuel substitution. However, there's no evidence on the impact of the exemptions on output. This is an important factor because this was at the center of the policy discussion. However, when we compare the effects, also we see a large difference between the notched policy scheme, which leads to around like 30 to 40% increase in electricity use, versus the reform schedule, which is quite smaller. So the marginal price response corresponding to the reform schedule has been around 1 order of magnitude below. In the paper, then we are having this small model, so I don't have time, unfortunately, today to go into detail. But with this model, we are able to disentangle a bit more the effects under these two schemes, and also talk towards about two stylized facts that we see that not all firms that are eligible take up the exemption. And second, also, we see that this manipulation is actually relatively limited under the setting in 2010. And then later on use this model to perform some counterfactual simulations. Again, because of time, I don't have time constraints, I don't have too much possibility to go into details here. So let me just conclude. So in this paper, we're analyzing the impact of the large exemption scheme on German manufacturing. We provide evidence that these exemption schemes might not be fully effective in a way to increase competitiveness of the exempted industry. Rather, we show that depending on the policy design, these exemptions can lead to distortions in energy input mixes and lead to increased electricity use in particular. That might have also an implication on carbon emissions. Finally, these policy simulations highlight also that policy design matters. So our design cautions against the use of notched exemption schemes, especially if compliance costs are relatively limited and the exemptions are large enough. And I'm just going to conclude here. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email also. And the paper is available also on my website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this very interesting presentation, very to the point. Is there a question in the room? So otherwise, I have a question from the chat. So actually 2 questions, if you want to answer one of them first and the other one. The first one would be, do you have like international comparisons, and how does it compare to other schemes that might be similar with potentially better practices across the world? And also, do you see room for having potentially a conditionality to tax exemptions for large industries, such as what we see in the ETS reform with the potential allocation of carbon credits, free carbon credits conditions to the fact that firms would have to implement decarbonization action plans?
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are all very, very good questions. So regarding the first point on an international comparison, so actually not a lot of studies that have been focusing towards this type of exemption schemes. So while there's an increasing or like growing body of literature that focuses on type of stringency of environmental regulation, our perspective was more like, okay, there's been a regulation in place. What's the impact really of those exemptions? In other contexts, yeah, our paper, unfortunately, given the detailed data needs that we have here, just focuses on the German context. So I cannot talk directly how this would apply to other nations. But I know these exemption schemes have been in place in other countries as well. For example, Italy, the UK also had some similar exemption schemes at some point. But there would be interesting idea to study those and then compare them. But data limitations are a bit tricky here. Regarding the second question of conditionality, that's a very good point. And actually the policy itself, I mean, when it was implemented, it included also tasks in terms of energy efficiency. So those firms, in order to be exempted, needed also to engage in some kind of energy management system. However, for the type of firms that we are studying here and this time frame, they were not very binding. So, for example, our findings really speak around like the type of firms that are probably small and medium-sized in manufacturing, that we can directly identify those effects. But very large firms who have probably more stringent additional regulations in terms of energy efficiency investment might have a different responses. That's an important point also to take into account here.
Right. Thank you very much, Stefan. I think we'll have many things to comment on the policy side with our policy experts, with Agnes Benatikere, also being here in the room with her team. But we'll come back to you in the second policy session. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Tim Chidkate, who's a postdoctoral associate at the MIT's Sloan School of Management. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Just sharing the presentation. So I'm going to talk about the calls for electricity market reforms. I am aware that this morning the European Commission finally released their public consultation on how to reform the electricity market. I already read it. It is here. And luckily, I didn't have to adjust my presentation too much to be offline of what they were saying in that consultation. So what is the diagnosis? There's an observation that there's some radical calls to overthrow the existing regulatory compound around power markets that has been built up in the last 2-3 decades. But what is actually happening is there's a large unexpected gap between short-term marginal prices driven by high gas prices and some unavailability of nuclear power plants and other issues versus the re-estimated long-run marginal cost of new generation, especially renewable generation, and also some existing inframarginal units who are actually earning some nice money these days. So ideally, if prices are very high, we want massive amount of new generation coming in, especially renewables, but this is maybe not happening as fast as we want to. So this gap is going to remain for a couple of years, probably. So there's a political desire to close that gap and let end users benefit more from these reduced cost of RES and potentially existing inframarginal units such as nuclear and hydro. So for many months, even more than a year, the discussion has wrongly focused on spot market design. And luckily, it seems that we're moving beyond that point of splitting the markets, blowing up the spot market, the marginal pricing versus pay as bid. It seems to be behind us if you read the Commission consultation, because it's I think that the spot market, and especially the integrated spot market as we know it in Europe, is extremely important to dispatch least cost, to share electricity across borders. And in the renewable system, as indicated by Professor Hogan, that short-term marginal signal will become even more important to look to signal to demand, to storage, whatever you want. But we have been relying too much on that short-term signal, but it doesn't mean that it therefore decreases in importance or we should completely mute it. So the debate has shifted. It has shifted to redistribution without or trying to limit the impact on the dispatch. And that's actually what that means, is complementing the long-term market. And there are many important questions in that regard. And I think those are the questions that we will debate about in the next couple of months. I think they're also put forward in the Commission's consultation. And I pick out 3. The first one is, how large is the role of the government as the counterparty with long-term contracts with new incoming renewables? What is the ideal long-term contract design for new incoming renewables? And whether and how to engage with existing inframarginal generation. And I will briefly go over my comments. I don't have definite answers to these questions because these are, let's say, very big and very complicated questions. So how large is the role of the government as a counterparty in long-term contracts with new renewables? Well, this is nothing new in Europe. I mean, that has been happening since the last decade, but this is, let's say, more becoming generalized. And there are 2 extremes. You could say we only rely on the government as a counterparty for new renewables, which basically means banning the merchant model, or we gradually reduce the role of the government because we believe that the renewables, they don't need any support anymore or no backup from the government anymore. Those are the 2 extremes. There are arguments, I would say, for increased role of government, but not an exclusive role of governments. On the seller side, I mean, the side of the renewables, you can really reduce financing costs with this public counterparty, and you have a more level playing field between incumbents and more independent renewable developers. On the buyer side, it's important that actually the government buys it on behalf of especially small commercial and residential consumers, because who else is going to go into these long-term hedges? Because retailers are not doing it, maybe 1 year, 2 years, but nothing beyond that. And it's kind of that lack that has created, to a certain extent, this price shock that many households have been feeling. And there's also an argument for coordination, because you can better align the national renewable targets and the grid development. And grid development is really a big deal, because if grid connection is scarce, you really have to choose on how much will you allow the government to do, how much do you leave open for merchants. If grid connection is no problem, you just say the government does a bit and the merchants do whatever they want to do. But if that is not the case, you have to find some kind of way to at least auction off connections for merchants and not do the first come, first serve approach anymore. Now, the second question, what is the ideal long-term contracts for new renewables? I know Leon might comment as well on that, but also on my first question, of course. So far, renewables have been kept blind from the system, because the idea was reduce financing costs, reduce uncertainty as much as you can, because they're costly and their share is not that much in the mix. But renewables mature, they can offer ancillary services, they can play closer into real time, they can do more advanced stuff, and their share increases. So keeping them blind, these distortions become more important. So everybody talks about CFDs, we need to have CFDs for new renewables, but there's 1,000 shades of gray on how to exactly design the CFD. So there's again two extremes: keep the renewables blind, which are hourly settled as produced CFDs, the ones like, for example, in place in the UK, and I think in France as well to some extent, or expose renewables at least to at the margin to the spot. And those are this deemed capacity, yardstick, financial CFDs, and so on. It's all about decoupling the physical production from the financial flows. But there's a difficult empirical question, and I haven't seen an answer to that, is whether the avoided distortions, both in the short run and the long run, because it impacts investment as well, of these more advanced CFD designs weigh up against potential increases in financing costs because of more at least presumed risk. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not 100% sure, because we need to do simulations, empirics, and so on, but it is an important question when you think about that design. Now, the last question, whether to engage with existing inframarginal generation. Well, I like this quote from the Serre report talking about market design, which says that if all new generation is subject to 15-year CFDs and the generation plans last for 30 years, then it would take 15 years to cover 50% of the generation with these long-term contracts. At the same time, the average price that the renewable power plant receives in the spot market starts to diverge more and more from the load-weighted average price. Well, what that means that if you have a bunch of consumers on being backed up by CFDs indirectly by the government, and there's a new price shock in 5 years or 7 years, this scenario just repeats if we don't do anything else, because there's a massive amount of generation that is still doing like we have been doing right now, very short hedges and so on. So the question is, what are you going to do with these massive pack of existing generation? And then I'm mostly talking about nuclear and hydro plants, which are in 2020, they served a bit less than 40% of the load in the EU. And this has also been reflected in the Commission publication. Like, what do? You can keep the revenue cap in place, keep it permanently, and further do nothing. I think that would not be a good idea, because this revenue cap is very hard to design and there will always be distortions, and it will be very uncertain that suddenly it resurfaces or not, or you change the whatever agreements around it. You can negotiate long-term contracts with incumbents, which is what they've done in California. It's probably not a good idea when the house is on fire to sign these kind of long-term contracts at very prices, which might become costly if you look at the longer run. You can impose long-term contracts with regulated prices. This is maybe easier if your nuclears are publicly owned versus privately owned, and the same for hydro. This is basically what has been in place in France for AREN. This is what the Spanish government is actually pushing for, but nuclears are private, so it's not that obvious to do that from a legal perspective, and also maybe from an economic perspective if you want. And to do that non-distortive is very tricky. You can introduce sort of price cap mechanisms like a relief valve, but this would be a bit like the Iberian mechanism that every once in a while pops up. I think that's not such a good idea. You can introduce market-based insurance mechanisms. That is what we have been writing about, affordability options. You can introduce a market maker obligation for incumbents. That is something that the Commission does not talk about in their public consultation, but I think it's an important way forward. Or there might be other mechanisms. And I don't have a predetermined answer or a final answer to this, but I think it will be really a big battle in the next couple of months, this kind of question. So my two takeaways: why is there a call for a market reform? Because there's this gap between short-term prices, long-term prices, which weighs heavy on consumers and the political class. What to do in this crisis, or what does it teach us? Spot markets are not broken. It doesn't mean that they cannot be improved. Long-term markets have been the issue. Go find a solution there. Probably an increased roles of government for this counterparty, an improved contract design for RES, some way of engagement with existing generation, which might depend from one country to another. And maybe to relate to the presentation of Stefan, we need to think about a transparent allocation mechanism of the benefits and the costs of these long-term contracts. He was talking about industry who wants to be exempt from certain, let's say, maybe renewable levies. But if you want to be exempt from renewable levies and prices are suddenly high, you will also not benefit from the benefits that they bring when prices are high. So this is really something that has to be very transparent, and the government then has to choose who these benefits goes to, who these costs goes to. And right now, this is very much, let's say, untransparent. Things I have not covered, but also need attention is, of course, CRM, demand response, retail regulation, and so on. But time is very limited, and I probably went already over it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. You didn't go over time at all, and it was a really interesting and comprehensive presentation, given the time that you were given. So I would have maybe two follow-up questions. So you mentioned the increase in financing costs that would be induced by long-term contract design for new renewable energy supply. So this increase in financing costs, did you see any assessments of the financing costs of the current crisis? I know there can be many ways of assessing it, but I would be interested to have your views on that. And maybe also, because you didn't touch upon this, if you had some ideas on the retail market that you didn't want to touch upon, but I think it's also a very important part of the upcoming reform. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yes, very good questions. Thank you. About these financing costs of RES, I think there's quite a bit of academic publications out there who say, I mean, I know there's some from Carsten Neuhoff, there's one from DTU, from Lena Kitzik as well. I think what they say is that even though renewables, if you look at the levelized cost of energy is lower than the average wholesale price you could get, that there's still a lot of, let's say, public money to be saved by having this counterparty being the government and not necessarily having to go there out in the market. They have the numbers there. It's like a couple of % on the WACC that they estimate, which is, I mean, billions if you look at 2050 timeline. But again, this is really where you need academic research, empirical analysis, simulation analysis, and so on. And this is not really my expertise. I only read things and I then kind of try to learn from that. About the retail market, it's very complicated, because if you really have this increased role of the government, which somehow on behalf of households and small commercials starts having more and more contracts, and somehow what you create is a sort of government hedge, which is not necessarily bad. But then what is then the role of the retailer? If one of its important roles is actually providing consumers with a hedge, but the government already takes care of that, and what remains? I'm sure there's still a lot of stuff that remains, but it's one of their core tasks that is somehow taken away from them for good reasons or bad reasons. Because you could also say, okay, we're going to have a decentralized obligation on suppliers that they have to get longer hedges and so on. But there's all kind of difficulties as well with that. It's not a very simple solution, because then consumers switch and you had a hedge of so many years on behalf of consumers. Okay, maybe the consumer takes the hedge with him or her. Maybe you have a secondary market for these kind of long-term hedges. I mean, there are many ways to come to the same goal, but one might be more costly than another. But if it's really an increased role of the government, then I think the role, at least in that task of hedging, of the retailer will decrease or just vanish. And then you have to think about, well, what is exactly the role? And I mean, it turned out that retail regulation was not very positive in this crisis, especially in UK, but also Czech Republic. I think there was a massive bankruptcy and so on.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're running perfectly on time, and now I would like to turn to Nicolas Astier, who's here with us today. Thank you, Nicolas, for joining us Physically, yeah. So Nicolas is a professor at the Paris School of Economics and the École des Ponts. So Nicolas.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, the floor is yours. So Tanguy is going
I'm sure the slides were right. So thanks a lot for having me. So Tim told us about the plans from the European Commission. Just a quick transition from that. So if you look at the, okay, does that work? Yeah. In the REPowerEU action that the European Commission issued, not this morning, so it was easier to look at them. An important item is to accelerate the transition towards clean energy and having more and more renewables to the grid and faster. And when you look at the detail from this plan, a big paragraph is on solar PV. And so if you want to accelerate the deployment of solar PV, a very low-hanging fruit is basically to have it more cost efficient. What I mean by cost efficient is for a given objective of install capacity, have more per euro invested. And so the purpose of this talk is to give some ideas of what we can learn from the past to improve from our mistakes in the past. So an important feature of solar PV is that it's very modular. So a solar panel is very small. And so you can build solar PV installation in many different ways. So you can do either very huge utility scale power plants that connect to the transmission grid like we do with conventional power plants. So that's on the left of the slide. Or you can do very much smaller installation that will be on your roof, that would be on your parking lot, and they connect directly to the distribution grid. So that's on the right part of the picture. So if you want to have actual picture, that's what it looks like, a big thing in the field, or something in your roof on the right. And so when you think about this wide array of possibilities when it comes to installing solar panels, there is some kind of public policy puzzle in the sense that if you look historically, the per kilowatt hour subsidy for solar PV has been consistently higher for smaller installations. So this is for France, but this is pretty much the case in every country. And that had real implication on what type of solar installation people have been installing. So this graph is for France. That's a cumulative installation of solar units in France. And so the dark blue wedge is large installation. All the rest will be much smaller ones. So what we see is that having this wedge between the small and big installation had a big impact on having mostly distributed generation on the French power grid. But that's surprising because over this period of time, smaller installation have been consistently more expensive on the per kilowatt hour basis. So the cost to produce 1 kilowatt hour of solar energy has been consistently higher with distributed energy versus utility scale. So that leads to two research questions. So is there a way to rationalize this policy on efficiency grounds only, which is what economists usually care about at least as a starter? And if not, can we get some back of the envelope or more detailed estimate of the opportunity cost of whichever policy goals this policy wants to achieve, because efficiency is not the only thing the policymaker cares about. So to have a framework in mind, so if you think of the value of 1 megawatt hour produced by a solar facility, you can think that it's basically gross social value minus cost. So the costs that are borne by whoever installs the installation. So the costs themselves cannot really justify heterogeneity in the level of per kilowatt hour subsidy. So to justify heterogeneous policies in terms of like depending on the installation, you have to look for heterogeneity in value. And there are three main things you can think of. The first one is when you produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, it goes to the grid, it displaces another unit, a coal power plant, a nuclear power plant, whatever. And this unit that is displaced may have a different private cost. It has different fuels, it has different externalities. And that's the case in a country like the US, for example. If you produce in Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of coal, it has a much higher, it reduces CO2 emissions much more than if you produce in California, say. But in France, which is the country we're interested in, over the period we're looking at, there is very few transmission congestion, so the displaced plant is pretty much the same wherever you produce. So to look for heterogeneous values that might justify heterogeneous policy, you have to think of other values. And the value people think of with distributed generation is grid savings. The intuition is very simple. You put your solar panel on your roof, that's exactly what you need to consume electricity. So it has to be the case that on the long run, you get some kind of savings in terms of future grid investment. But although this reasoning is true on average, whether it's massive in terms of levels really depends on when you produce electricity, because you plan the grid to be able to serve peak demand, not average demand. And so the type of savings you're going to get by installing distributed generation will really depend on whether your distributed unit produced on peak or off peak locally in the distribution grid. And so in this recent paper, we try to address that, because we try to address that from observational data, because the issue is that if you put that in a simulation model of a given grid, you can reach any result, because it just depends on whether these two things match, like whether you produce when you need it. And so there are endless debate about whether this is the case, with solar advocates on one hand and more incumbent people on the other hand. So what we do is we actually get to the actual power grid in France. So we focus on this key asset in green here, which is a substation. So that's basically the interface between a distribution grid and the transmission grid, where conventional generation feeds electricity into. And so what we see here at the interface is a power flows, basically the withdrawal from a given neighborhood. And as you install more and more distributed generation to this neighborhood, you will have a change in power flows that tells you on the long run whether you expect or not grid savings locally. So there are about 2,000 substations in France. We access data for 15 years for those. And we basically estimate the difference between, so if I go back to the previous slide, we estimate the difference between these two curves normalized by installed capacity. So we want to see whether when you install 1 megawatt of solar, does it change the top quantiles, so peak hours, or the bottom quantiles. And so the result we get is a golden curve on that graph. So that's key. And so what we see for France is that we basically don't see any impact in peak. The reason, I mean, the underlying intuition being most of peak in France is driven by electric heating. There's not much PV production in the winter evening. So we don't see a lot of, or not at all, any average contribution of solar PV on decreasing future grid needs at the distribution level. Okay. So now that you, for the case of France, you don't see much heterogeneity in marginal gross value that would justify heterogeneous level of subsidies. The next question is, okay, these public policies still have some goals, so they might have alternative goals, such as like spreading PV over the territory, avoiding large sites, creating local jobs. So the next thing we can do is estimate the opportunity cost of pursuing these policy objectives using these heterogeneous subsidies versus other policy tools. So that's what we are doing in some ongoing work. And so what we are doing is we basically we take a three-step procedure. So first, we take the universe of existing solar installation in France as given. So we don't reallocate a power plant to new sites. We don't look at hypothetical sites. And then we keep the trajectory of production constant, so that the actual value generated is constant, because we said that the marginal value was the same. And then we basically re-optimize the commissioning date to see how much we could have saved by commissioning these plants in the right order, if you wish. And so what we get basically is that our very preliminary results suggest that we might have saved about 30% of investment, which would have been available to basically build more PV. And the main reason being we have installed residential PV very, very early in France, and that was a very, very costly move. Okay, so to wrap up, so in the context of accelerating solar PV deployment in Europe, improving cost efficiency could be a very important lever. And we show with the historical case study of France that opportunity cost of misallocation in this setting can be large. And in particular, it's not obvious from that research that there is a strong rationale for having higher or significantly higher per kilowatt hour subsidy for distributed solar over grid scale solar. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for this really insightful presentation. I would have maybe 2-3 questions. Actually, similarly, are you aware of other studies that could have been conducted, for example, in Germany, where they also deployed solar PV quite early? And I would also wonder if it is about like a grid investment optimization. Are you also working together with researchers working on the demand side reduction? And I might have another question, but maybe let's you first
Yeah. So on the first one, I mean, Stefan would talk about his research on the value of solar in Germany. So the existing literature really look at the value component because I mean that's like case studies have been carried in context where transmission grid was a big issue because the US is large and the generation mix are very different, or Germany's well-known transmission grid issues. So the literature tend to focus on that, and there are some figures and some evidence looking that there is misallocation there as well. Like you tend to put too much PV in places where the marginal value of electricity is not as high as in other places where you don't put some. And I mean, the order of magnitude would be like 5% inefficiencies in this setting. So yeah, there are cases, but then the way you frame them really depend on the context of your study and whether basically value costs are heterogeneous. But the idea that costs are very heterogeneous is not so much explored in the literature for a reason I don't know. But I think that's interesting to look at. And on demand side, so one thing we do in the paper that I didn't discuss is to try to say, okay, but yeah, tomorrow there will be storage, and that's a game changer. Now, if you couple storage with small PV installation, then you can tailor your storage to actually shape the peak you need. That's true in some settings. In France, unfortunately, you need a lot of it because you don't plan the grid for the extreme peak. You plan it for a little bit before because you take margins, and so you need to be able to shape the peak for a long duration. And with electric heating, you have high load during like 5, 6, 10 hours, and that's higher than the duration of a typical battery. So you can achieve some savings, but you need a lot of it. And demand response, I guess, would be the same kind of issue in the sense that you need very sustained decrease in load during peak hours, and so if the peak is very wide, then it's harder to get.
Yeah. I was thinking more about like reducing the peak by, for example, like renovating houses and. But one last question then would be, how do you define the difference? I mean, where do you put the difference between distributed PV and grid scale PV? Because I mean, a PV solar plant, however big it is, will never be as large as a nuclear plant, and we could also have this like territorial planification in mind.
Yeah, so for the purpose of this study, it's really where it connects, or whether it connects to the transmission grid or distribution grid. On the last point, I mean, there is some studies about building a 1 gigawatt power plant in France. So I'm not sure on the second point whether it's not going to go as big, at least in terms of peak capacity, in terms of average production, that's a lot. But yeah, so for the purpose of this paper, it's really where it connects to the grid.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Nicolas.
Okay.
Looking forward to discuss further this very interesting topic with the policy experts. So now I will turn to Dorothée Charlet for our last presentation. So Dorothée is assistant professor at the Université Savoie Mont-Blanc. So Dorothée, the floor is yours. Oh, your microphone is off, I think. Sorry.
Sorry. So I'm going to present the issues of fuel poverty in the residential sector with an European comparison. So this presentation is a mix of different researches that I conducted about measurement, drivers, consequences, and policy evaluation of the phenomenon. I think, first of all, something that we need to have in mind is about the magnitude in Europe. It's an average about the share of space heating in our total energy consumption. Space heating represents more than 62% of our total energy consumption, and space cooling right now just a very small part of a total share. I'm saying this because it's maybe a tease on my opening in conclusion, but space heating is mostly linked to the question of insulation in the building. In this sense, in Europe, we have a lot of what we call decrepit buildings, that is to say non-energy efficient building, where we do not save.
We're not seeing your presentation properly.
I don't know why, sorry.
It would really be a pity if we couldn't enjoy the full view of.
Could you slide more?
Yeah.
Yes, maybe sometimes it's linked to the fact that I'm using maybe my Apple, so not. But maybe if I put in this.
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, so I can reduce. Sorry for the convenience. And like I said, we have a lot of bad consequences about the fact that the share of inefficient building in Europe are so huge. And one of them is linked to the fact that more than 50 million Europeans live in energy poverty situations. So it is one consequence, not the only one, but one of them. And what is a fuel poor or an energy poor in Europe? If I take the European Commission definition, energy poverty is a situation in which households are unable to access essential energy services and products. And we have three main causes of energy poverty in Europe. One of them is due to low income. The two other causes are linked to high energy cost. And it's a very topical subject right now in Europe and also in France. And it's also linked to inefficient homes. So a lot of public policies dedicated to fight energy poverty are instaurated to help low-income households, but also to trigger energy efficiency investment in all the dwelling. So to give you a big pictures about energy poverty in Europe, we have high rates of energy poverty, and these high rates are correlated with poverty rates. And to have an idea, more than 50% of Europeans are poor. And it is also linked to the question of food poverty, but also to health issues. And if I take a look to a European map about people that declare to live in inefficient building, what is one cause of fuel poverty, we can divide Europe into two main areas. We have the south of Europe, where a huge share of people declare to have some difficulty to keep home adequately warm. And more specifically, we are Mediterranean countries where the share of inefficient building is also very high. And after that, we have the north of Europe, where some people declare to have inability to keep home warm, but this share is smaller compared to the south. And in line with the fact that we have a lot of inefficient dwelling, we have also around 6% of European households that declare to have difficulty to pay the energy bill. Sometimes it is due to high energy costs. Sometimes it is due to the fact that the need for energy in the dwelling due to inefficiency is very high. And this conclusion can be made because we have a share of people living in dwelling with leaky roof, damp walls, floors or foundation, or rotten windows frames, very important in the south of Europe. So this can be linked to my previous slide about the fact that this type of people have some difficulties to maintain an adequate temperatures in the dwelling. So the profile of fuel poor people is very varied according to European countries, but sometimes we found elderly people, more specifically retired people. Sometimes we found young people, students, but all these people live in poorly-insulated housing in rural areas, and they also could be owners of individual houses. Another interesting fact, and this is for the design of future public policies, is about the magnitude of cooling in our total energy expenditures. For 2 years right now, the increase of cooling is increasing very fast. And in 2020, to give you an idea of the discomfort due to heat waves, we have 52% of households that say that they suffer from the heat for at least 24 hours. So in this sense, we need to think about the consequences of fuel poverty, especially in winter, but we also need to have in mind that fuel poverty can occur in summer when people do not have the possibility to reach a certain level of well-being. So we have a lot of risk factors due to the thermal discomfort. We have some risk factors in winter. For example, one of them, the most important, is maybe a risk of hypothermia when people do not have the ability to switch on the heating system because they do not face too high energy cost. But we have also other sanitary issues where children are exposed, for example, due to moisture and mold. But we also have high numbers of extra deaths in summers due to heat waves and the temperature inside the dwelling. So we should have in mind that even if in Europe we deal with energy poverty issues as a problem of winter, it will also be probably in the future a problem of summer. And the consequences in terms of cost are very important when we have to deal with the question of energy poverty, because we have a lot of hazard due to inadequate housing. We have direct costs associated with many consequences, for example, the welfare costs, but also energy bills, etc., etc. But we have also indirect costs. For example, when people are unable to work, or when children are in a bad situation and they cannot go to school. And all of these costs associated together represent a huge amount of cost for Europe as overall. And in this sense, the public policies dedicated to fight energy poverty in Europe are very numerous. We have different policies depending on the country where we are located. But if I give an example, the French case, for example, we have different types of measures. We have some palliative measures and we have some preventive measures. Preventive measures are mostly dedicated to trigger energy efficiency investments in the residential sector. And some of them are regulatory measures. I can cite, for example, the building codes. Some others are mostly financial incentives, such as income tax deduction, VAT, or some bond loans with zero interest. We can also find in Europe some decarbonization measures in order to help households to invest in renewables and in more clean energy. And in this sense, today, a lot of measures need to be faster in order to help people to face the rising energy cost. But also we should have in mind that the energy poverty is a dynamic phenomenon where the people concerned can evaluate according to the evolution of energy prices, but also the evolution of income. And in this sense, preventive measures seems more suitable than palliative measures because they help to prevent the phenomenon, especially in a context where some people could be vulnerable. And my conclusion is to say that if we renovate a lot of buildings in Europe, we can have many benefits. One of them is to prevent people for energy poverty, but it's not the only one. We can save also money for our healthcare system. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dorothée, for this very insightful presentation and very timely because we're in the midst of the energy price crisis. I would have a question about how come, so we have so many policies on energy poverty alleviation, be it at the EU or national level, you very well highlighted the multiple benefits that we can draw from it. And I think these figures date from before the crisis. So I think multiple benefits are even higher now, adding energy security as a top benefit. But we still have such a tremendous amount of people that cannot afford to heat themselves. So I mean, so because you've worked on policy options, what are the best practices that you would recommend, and maybe also potentially to launch the discussion after with our policy experts?
Yes, I think it's sometimes a hard question to answer, but we first focus on the quality of insulation, because in energy efficiency can be active or passive, and according to some engineer, first we need to insulate the building. After that, we need to help people to buy for more efficient appliances, and finally we need to have some to have more sobriety behavior. And as you said, we have many differences in Europe according to practices, according to the nature of buildings. But considering the fact that energy poverty is one consequence of inefficient building, I think that policies that can help the poorest household to invest or to live in decent housing can help. These measures can be some income tax deduction, for example, but also subsidies. But another measure can be to let people, especially when they are renters, to live in a social, or to increase the proportion of people living in social housing, because in social housing you have only one landlord, and this landlord has some face to regulatories, and they need to renovate and to propose adequate housing to people. So today, to give an access to the poorest household to this type of housing can help.
It's very, very clear. My second question would be, maybe, I don't know if you followed the debate on the ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund, but what is Initiative? What is your perspective on that, very shortly?
To be honest, I have some difficulties to forecast the future about what happened, because today I think that we in Europe households may face to many issues that can have some many consequences of their well-being, and every measure can help, but we need to evaluate each measure separately to have a proper idea of expected benefits.
Very clear. Thank you very much. And also expanding a bit the debate about the inflation and potential costs on households beyond the energy field, of course. So thank you all, Stefan, Dorothée, Tim, Nicolas, for these very passionate presentations. I'm glad that we at least have some more time to discuss these really interesting findings with our policy experts. I will give the floor to Johannes Linde after a 15 minutes break, right?
Yes, we had the buffer. We had the buffer established here, and given that some of the colleagues may just only join for the policy panel, I would suggest that maybe we keep adhere to the timeline, and that we then start at quarter to 4 very sharply, so not to lose time. Because you did such an excellent time management, all of you, and our buffer of 15 minutes wasn't really needed. So, but as I said, given that the audience may actually expect us to start only at quarter to 4, we will now have a short break and then reconvene very sharply at 15:45. Thank you.